Welcome everyone to the CGHE seminar number 222. I suppose non-mathematically that's 1/3 of a great beast. It sounds like quite a number, doesn't it? 222 seminars in 5.5 years. It's really good to have such a great team with us today to talk about how academic work might be changing in the context of COVID-19. Our coordinates for today's discussion are time and space, and we know that time and space have a materiality, and they're also matters of perception and imagining, and those two things go together in physics and in real life in so many ways. To explore the interrelationship between the material and the matters of interpretation, theorization, and perception, we have a great panel. Melina Aarnikoivu, Terhi Nocala, and Taina Saarinen, who's going to lead off. Now, before I introduce our speakers properly, let me take you quickly through the webinar protocols. Many will be familiar with these already. Now, remember that the webinar is being recorded. It'll be posted online on the CGHE website in due course, and it's being watched on YouTube. We find more than it's being watched live now. A transcript of the chat function from today's conversation will also be posted on the CGHE website. Now, during the webinar, keep yourself muted unless you've been asked to speak, unless we're at the stage of the Q&A. And there's no need to have your video on during the webinar either, but we advise you to turn on both your audio and your video when you come into the Q&A discussion. We recommend using the speaker view so you can more clearly see who is talking. That speaker view is found as the red arrow shows in the top right-hand corner of the Zoom screen. Now, to ask a question, come in through the chat first. Type your question out, indicate that you want to say something. It may be a statement rather than a question, of course, and that way I'll be able to identify you and include you in the Q&A sequence once the speakers have stopped presenting. Ideally, we'll have about 30 minutes of discussion. 25-30 minutes is normal for our webinars, and it's the most important part of the webinar in many ways. So do consider your questions carefully as the speakers are winding up towards the sort of halfway point in the hour, and do type your questions early into the chat. Then I'm more likely to be able to see you and select you into the discussion. When you're invited to ask your question, please unmute yourself and turn on your video, and then state your name and where you are from, and then say what you want to say. Well, it's a great pleasure to introduce our speakers now, and I'll start with Melina. Melina Aarnikoivu is a postdoctoral researcher at the Finnish Institute of Educational Research, University of Jyväskylä in Finland. I think still directed by my friend Jussi Velima. Her research interests include doctoral education, academic writing, and ethnographic research methodologies. She has other interests, other activities, including being an assistant editor at the Journal of Praxis in Higher Education, and she's coordinator of the important early career researchers network in the Consortium of Higher Education Researchers in Europe. That's ECHER, E-C-H-E-R. A great website. If you're looking for something to do, have a look at the ECHER website at some stage. Our second presenter is Terhi Nocala, senior researcher at the University of Jyväskylä, and her research focuses on the interplay between higher education policy, organizational parameters, and academic work, with a specific interest in comparative methodology, which she's written on quite a lot, and discourse analysis. She has important editorial duties. The price of being an early mid-career researcher is, if you're good at what you do, is you get lots of more jobs than you ever expected. And Terhi is one of the coordinating editors of Higher Education, and she's also working with internationalization of higher education policy and practice. Our lead presenter is Taina Saarinen, and she's research professor of higher education, also as Terhi is at the FIER at University of Jyväskylä. Her recent research includes work on language and internationalization, new nationalism in higher education, a topic which many of us are exercised by at present, and academic well-being. She recently published the monograph, Higher Education, Language and New Nationalism in Finland. So I think there's already material for a lot of discussion in this webinar. I look forward to what our speakers have to say, and at this point, really happy to hand over to you, Taina.
Thank you, Simon. Thanks for the generous introduction. Yeah, as Simon said, we are going to, I'm mainly going to do the talking here, but Melina and Terhi will interrupt me when appropriate, and also maybe give me some pointers to the chat if I keep missing something. We just figured that it might be easier in this particular space in this particular time. I'm going to share my slides next, just a moment, and we'll get started. Okay, so if everything works correctly, you should be seeing my slides now in the presentation mode. Okay, great. So we'll be talking about times and spaces of academic work as a result of COVID-19. And of course, that's the first thing that we probably already want to question is, are the things that we are talking about a result of COVID, or are they just something that become visible or are maybe accentuated somehow as a result of the COVID pandemic? But in any case, we assume that COVID might have something to do with the things that we will be talking about. We'll say a little bit about academic work during the pandemic. We'll talk about temporal and spatial materialities, which we want to sort of focus on in this particular presentation. We'll give a really brief presentation of our data and methods, and mainly focus on our results, because I think that's, and we have to say these are preliminary results, but we'll focus on those because they are probably the interesting things that we might be most interested in discussing. And then, of course, we'll also have a lot of time for discussion and questions. And I'm kind of thinking, or assuming that this is something that a lot of you might be able to relate to. We are talking about what happens when basically the whole world goes on a lockdown. And I think a lot of us have in some ways experienced what happens when the world is temporarily closed, as the picture that Melina found depicts. We started making interviews. I'll say a little bit more about the data a bit later, but we started making the interviews almost immediately in the beginning of March in 2020. Terhi sent me email saying, should we do something about it? I think probably 2 days after the lockdown started or something like that, really quickly. And at that time, we were probably a bit naive, thinking that we would maybe do a couple of interviews, and by fall 2020, we'd be back on track and everything would be over. And of course, that's not what happened. And so what has happened is we've been conducting longitudinal data collection over a period of time. We've seen quite a lot of research pop up recently on academic work since 2020, and we would like to refer to this as pop-up research, because I think a lot of higher education researchers' focus turned to COVID when the pandemic started. There's a lot of interesting work coming up on academic work, on research collaborations, on international education, digitalization of education, family and caregiving responsibilities. And a lot of this research comes from a crisis approach or a crisis perspective, a pandemic perspective. What happens when the world stops? What happens when things start going differently? And a lot of the research also, and very rightly so, this is nothing that we don't have a problem with this, but a lot of that research also focuses on global and local inequities. And of course, this is also something that the crisis perspective, the inequities perspective also comes up in our research along the way. But in this presentation and in one part of the study, we want to particularly focus on the spatialities and temporalities of academic work. Maybe, as I said in the beginning, maybe from a larger perspective than just from the point of view of a pandemic period, a restricted period. When we think about the sort of from the material perspective, of course, the pandemic provides a kind of a disruption in our times and spaces in academic work. In different ways, probably as well. I know that being a middle-aged, in a permanent position, no children, I'm in a different position than a precarious researcher with maybe caregiving duties and so on. People are in very different situations, but all of us more or less felt a disruption in our times and spaces in this time. And when we think about those times and spaces, we have to think about them in terms of not as something, not as a context of something happening, not as a time when something's happening, but think of them in an assemblage that actually is part of the phenomena that we are looking at. So we are not just looking at the pandemic or the COVID or academic work during COVID during the time or in the spaces where we are, but actually looking at what happens when this time and this space and us as human actors meet in an assemblage. And that's when we actually start seeing the phenomenon. The phenomenon is not independent of the matter. The phenomenon is not independent of the time. So if you think about the times and places as somehow as existing structures, we also have to think about the meanings attached to these times and places. And this means that we are particularly looking at a socio-material phenomenon. The material conditions are not separate or distinct from humans, but an assemblage, an interrelationship, an intertwined phenomenon. Okay, so I'm sorry I'm a bit slow with my mouse because I had a new puppy today, and as a consequence my mouse is somewhere, so I'm taking a bit of time with finding my pad. Okay, so the data and methods. We have three groups of academics, mainly from Europe and North America. One group of mostly early career researchers, one group mostly of senior and administrative personnel, and one mixed group of actually a research group that works pretty closely together. We had altogether 4 to 8 meetings, that basically interviews, discussions with these groups, and we started in maybe the first interview in April when we started organizing these, and I think the latest interviews took place in May this year. So right now we have longitudinal data from over a year. In addition, we had 13 planning meetings. That is 13 meetings between the three of us, Melina, Terhi, and myself. And we consider these as our data as well, because we think that the researcher is very much a part of the assemblage of this whole phenomenon. We cannot distinguish ourselves from that. Not only because we are also academics who have been working during this pandemic, but because in any case, the researcher is always very much a physical part of the assemblage of this kind of a research. We've transcribed all our meetings, including our planning meetings, and we've done basically a rather, I would say, a very traditional qualitative content analysis and discourse analysis of the data. But what we are really actually pretty excited about is the longitudinal nature of the data that gives us some perspective into the developments. Okay. Very quickly an overview, and like I said, this is very much preliminary, and I'm all the time checking if Terhi and Melina are reminding me of something that I should be doing or saying at the moment, but please just pop open your mics if I'm missing something. We started pretty soon seeing things that somehow meant that obviously the meaning of work time changed. Work time was no longer basically an office time. I don't know how much that has ever been a thing for academics, but more so the work time started to be pushed towards different places and different times in the schedule of our interviewees. Also, the meaning of home time changed. Being at home became different, and the matters of being at home became different. What also became different was the emotions that were attached to these particular times changed. We started seeing that's how our interviews described them. We don't want to say that this is what happened, but this is how they basically described the developments. And these also changed during the 1 year period of our interviews and our discussions. So it was not just them describing changes in their work time, but also their emotions about this changes changed over time. There might have been a brief honeymoon period first, when you stayed at home, started working from home, or vice versa. There was the horrible complexity of organizing children's homeschooling, organizing everything, and then gradually getting into something of a system. So also all these things also changed over time. The same applies to spaces and things and artifacts and objects and matter. Things that used to be everyday started being extraordinary or strange. Artifacts that used to be things or matter became actors or agents in the situation. Spaces that used to be private became public and vice versa. Or in general, space started having some sort of agency, started being part of the work that academics were doing. And like as with time, matter, artifacts, things, spaces also started to be, were being attached meanings to. And we are not saying that this would have been different. I mean, I think we could equally well have interviewed people without the pandemic, and we might have seen all these, but we still think that somehow the pandemic accentuates what takes place. It has something of a strengthening effect on a lot of things. And again, reminding you that this is still very much preliminary and we're still working through the results. Some examples of the time issue. In many places, this very particularly relates to one group of interviewees who are working in the same university, and were facing the lockdown with the ruling that office spaces would be available at certain times. The times were distributed beforehand. People knew what the available times were. So they at some point said that they were having a secret meeting, a meeting without permission in a sense. And that was an interesting, like the idea of working in secret, working in the forbidden time in the office, and would be a secret. And of course, this is one of the first example which shows that also the times and spaces often become mixed and intertwined. It's really not possible to talk about time without space and the other way around. So when we talk about the certain times in the office, we also talk about the very physical office space. And when we talk about the secret meetings, it's not just the time that is secret, but also the place. In some of the examples, in some of the interviewees' discussions, we saw that time was in some situations, in a sense, constraining, and in other situations, condensing. There were different perspectives of what kinds of times they were available, what kinds of slots were available for working, what kinds of times that used to feel quick now started feeling slow, and the other way around. Time zones themselves became very material. So could say things like, when are we? So that was like a very physical question of when do we meet, where we meet, when are we in Zoom? And the one thing that was interesting also was that there's a lot of research, previous research on, for instance, Oili-Helena Yliopi's research on academic times and the different perspectives on academic time, the secured time or the undisturbed time as something that is valued and precious to academics, as something that is seen as valuable, because that feels like the time when we can do undisturbed work. And during a pandemic, this undisturbed work becomes an obstacle to doing things you want to do together with colleagues. So you start seeing things like, like one of the interviewers said, I want to be disturbed. I don't want to be undisturbed. I want to be disturbed. I want to be in a place where somebody comes and interrupts me and takes me to coffee or talks about work or whatever. So this kind of thing might change. Second set of examples from our spaces. People during lockdown started working in different, let's say that probably all still in a company, but in a different company. You started working with different people. You maybe started working from home. You might have the homeschooling kids there. You might have the partner who was also working from home. And the space that used to be a workspace with colleagues was now a workspace with family. So family, colleague times and spaces started mixing. Again, the times and spaces are inseparable here. Claiming space and giving up space is also an interesting aspect of the negotiations of how to claim your own space in your home environment, again with the different kinds of people in there. I'm actually in the picture on this slide. I'm working from sauna, from my sauna, and just for some reason was necessary to go there because that seemed to be the only place where there was no noise or no dogs or anything. So time, space becomes a matter of negotiation. Familiar spaces become unfamiliar and unfamiliar spaces become familiar. And this means familiar both in the sense of unknown or known, but also very literally familiar, because a lot of our examples were about people maybe in some situations moving back in with their parents, working from their childhood bedrooms, working from their parents' home, working alone versus in groups, and this also included the spaces like kitchen becoming not a place where you eat and meet your family, but the place where you hope your family doesn't come, where you hope you get your work done. So those spaces started changing meaning, and also the emotions that were attached to these things. And the same applies to space and place changing function. So from the spatial perspective, this would be one of the things that we observe. About artifacts, any kinds of artifacts, again intertwined with the spaces and times and with each other. An example of, for instance, a table might be signaling different things at different times. It might be a place where you find a corner to work at, or it might be a place where you eat, but also a table, buying a new table for yourself and placing it in the middle of a living room during a pandemic, signaling not just that you need to work from home and you need to find your own space, but it also means that since there's a pandemic going on, you can easily put another table in the middle of your living room, because that signals lack of guests, lack of company. Artifacts linked with emotions. For instance, an empty kitchen table signaling a lack of valued colleague sitting opposite. You might have been used to working from home with a colleague you work a lot together with, and then you sit opposite an empty desk, empty table, an empty seat by the desk. So also kitchen table signaling longing longing to be together with a valued colleague, working together with them. A simple example of a printer getting permission to go to office, sitting in an empty office no people there, but hearing the printer go on, and that signaling office time, that signaling company, and that signaling something good. So a printer being very much an agent in bringing good vibes, good feelings in the middle of a pandemic. As I've already said, we found that these times and spaces and artifacts were very difficult to tell apart in a sense. They were very much intertwined with each other, very much the times when we're talking about a disruption in time, there was also always very often a disruption in space or in the uses of the artifacts and the things that we think of when we think of artifacts. A lot of the work that our interviewers talked about was in somehow, well, I hate to say use the word margins because it's another spatial, it's a hierarchical metaphor in a sense, but it's somehow pushed to, work might have been pushed to early mornings or late evenings and to kitchen tables and to saunas and to places where we usually didn't work. And thinking about this in terms of the ways in which our work stretches, our time stretches, and we are used to somehow stretching as academics our work and our time in a particular way. Often, not always, but often from an office, often from a daytime, maybe starting early, maybe finishing late, but even so, like a daytime activity. At least the daytime activity being in a sense more preferred or prestigious even than nighttime activity, and often from an office rather than home. Of course, this would also have been different for different people. For those who liked working from home in previous times, now found themselves maybe disliking working from home and longing for the office. So that's always a disruption there as well. And there might be something here that continues what Dave Hoffman and Terhi, Nocala and others have talked earlier about. What happens when groups, academic groups, colleagues that work together are stretched in terms of geographical distance or in terms of generations or cultural beliefs or values or norms, disciplinary traditions, but also stretched in terms of the times that are available and the spaces that are available. And in that sense, we also were wondering, and again, reminding you that this is really preliminary, but also wondering if this would not be a particular case of work during a pandemic and then we go back to normal, but rather something that just adds another dimension to this very stretched academic work as it is already. So just for the discussion, we're coming close to the end, and for the sake of discussion, a reminder that we think that these times and places and artifacts and humans and everything is an assemblage. Not the matter is not hierarchically below us as humans, but it's a part of the way in which we work and part of the assemblage, how we present ourselves. And we had very few examples. There's plenty more in the data, but few examples of matter as having agency, the desk or the printer becoming a happy encounter in the office, or the phones and cameras, which were discussed. We didn't even mention this in the data, but the phones and cameras, which were often discussed in terms of somebody being present. When we talked about is somebody's phone on or is somebody's mic on, we're actually talking about a human being and whether they are present in the meetings. And then in a sense, we think about the pandemic, this might be one of the things that makes visible the material conditions and the importance of these material conditions in our work. So unless Terhi and Melina want to add something that I've missed, Terhi has a comment, yeah.
I think that if we take this discussion into kind of like to sort of a next level, which won't really be the topic of today's presentation, is that these realities linked to space and time, they also kind of acquire a different meaning when you bring into the employer-employee relationship of academics and their universities into the picture, in a sense that then questions of privacy and and where does the boundary between somebody's private life and what the employer can sort of request of us or demand of us, or of academics, for example, that changes where if for example, one is kind of requested to share their home environment, for example, with their students, and therefore their sort of privacy concerns. Same for students, obviously, kind of requested perhaps to keep their cameras on during lectures. So to what extent does the education institution, for example, sort of access their private space in a way? Or if universities are considering of in the aftermath of the pandemic of some of their office spaces, because it has been shown that this work can be done from home as well, that sort of has an impact on the expectations that the employer makes on people's or access to people's homes and to their employees' homes. I think that's also kind of like an interesting aspect.
And we actually already see examples of this. Yes, University of Tampere has been offering office furniture to take home as a gesture of sort of goodwill from the employer, but also obviously we also see what Terhi just mentioned, that this might also be seen as something of an invasion of into the privacy of the employees of the university. Absolutely. Unless there are other comments by Terhi or Melina, I think we would just like to leave you with the questions. Of course, you might have other questions as well, but we might have other questions. But I think we could think about, if we think about these issues in terms of crisis versus in terms of normal, whatever those mean, we might see different kinds of pictures emerging, and I think that might also be interesting. We've been talking a bit about the material perspective, so let's add some of the socio aspects to the discussion. So how do we understand academic work during crisis versus what is academic work during a normal time? But thank you.
Thanks to Taina and to Terhi. Melina, is there anything you want to add to what's been said?
There is a question.
Not right now, but I can jump in at some point.
I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to ask you to restrain yourself. Can you go into the chat? If you indicate to me that you want to speak, do it through the chat, please. I've got one first question. In relation to changes that are occurring, I sense that it's easy for us to create meetings, easier than it was ever before. And in the sort of second 6 months of the pandemic, the diary started to get really crowded. And this process has continued into the sort of third 6 month period. We seem to be getting loaded with meetings. It seems to be easier to create them, perhaps because they're kind of loose ties and there seems to be less at stake than there is in a face-to-face meeting, as this more limited form of sociability seems easier to invoke. I sense that we're intruding on each other and crowding on each other. It's not just our employer creating this problem. It's all of us, staff, students, working together. We're beginning to impose quite a difficult regime on each other. Colleagues, we've got a couple of people coming into the chat, and I think we'll start the discussion. Can I, Manuha Kumar, can you
Yes.
indicate in the chat, please, that what you want to raise before? I'm not going to let you in directly. I'm sorry. We don't do that. We do it through the chat.
I have a question.
All right. Okay. I give up. You can break in. Go ahead. You've beaten me.
Okay, I have a question. Hello.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. A question. Some people feel very boring at home, so they want to work and they are interested, but they don't know how to work at home.
Well, yeah, I don't know how to we didn't really, I think our experience was that a lot of times our interviews knew what they had to do at home, but the question was about finding the time or the space to do that and to find new ways of doing what they were doing. So I'm not quite sure if I caught the gist of the question, but that's my impression anyway.
I'd like to bring in Celia Whitchurch at this point. Celia's been working on some, related set of issues.
Oh, great.
Celia.
Can you hear me? I don't think
Yes,
you
can
see
now
me.
hear you.
Yeah.
You can hear me.
Yeah.
So thank you very much indeed for this presentation. Respondents probably know that our CG project 3.2 has been looking at questions of academic agency in relation to time and space. So all our interviews were conducted before the pandemic, it has to be said. But we found that there was considerable evidence of people trying to stretch the time and space available to them. And I just wondered if you found that there was evidence of people making positive adjustments to the time and space that they now felt they had available to them out with the university walls, if you like, the total quotient of time and space, particularly in respect of work-life balance, and using their own agency with a sense of being freer of material boundaries. I mean, I just wondered if there were any positive aspects that obviously people are juggling. It may be that people felt more pressed, but were there any advantages? And were boundaries more fluid, I think is what I'm trying to say. I look forward very much to reading your work. Thank you.
Thank you. I can start by saying that absolutely there were also these kinds of positive, if you think about them in terms of positive stretchings of times. The examples were like taking care of elderly parents that might have been difficult otherwise, or organizing maybe physical exercise, or focusing on things like that, not having to commute to work. So all these also came into the stretching of the times and places. Absolutely, yes. Melina, Terhi, you can jump in if you come up with more examples.
I think that, sorry, Taina, I think that here we can see very clearly the sort of haves and the have-nots, in a sense that it's very polarized in terms of or like between people who have spacious apartments, don't necessarily have caregiving duties, but have a lot of work duties. And for them, the ability to work from home, ability to kind of rearrange their day to make more space and time available for their own well-being, such as sort of a lunchtime breaks, sort of yoga on the yoga type. And then the people working in like small apartments where there's sort of children wandering in and out, or moving to sauna, as Taina said, or a bathroom or wardrobe to get a sort of a moment of peace and quiet, and sort of trying to snatch those moments for work throughout the day or night in some cases. So this kind of, in a way, polarizes the academic labor force in a way.
Got a lot of people now coming into the chat, which is great. Our next comment will come from Yale Harlap. Yale.
Hi, you want me to speak?
Yes, please.
Yes. So thank you so much. This was very interesting. And I'm about to start a project with a colleague where we interview academics about their teaching during the pandemic period, and how the shift to teaching online affects their reflections on teaching in general and the enterprise of higher education, what it means. And I was curious whether, although this strays a little bit from what you have presented today, but whether you have any inklings of discussions about teaching in your subject material.
There was discussion of, like you said, how teaching could be organized, how jumping into online teaching. And I think what was actually what seemed to be in my interviews, at least the thing that seemed to be more concerning was the return back to face-to-face meeting or even hybrid teaching, which seems to be like one way of saying that you have to teach both online and face-to-face. But I have to say that for some reason we didn't particularly ask about teaching as such. We very basically asked, our very basic questions were things like, what did you do today? So it was very much like very open-ended questions. And teaching came up in questions of supervision. How do you supervise online versus face-to-face? And that was something that some of my interviews were concerned about. But Melina and Terhi, you might have, we did different, we all had our own groups. So we have our own. What did your group say would be the next question?
One thing that we can recognize in terms of teaching is sort of that different higher education systems have a different situation, because they're different. That the pandemic doesn't look the same in Finland than it does in UK or US, for example. And then what we can see is that in some of the systems that are very much sort of tuition fee driven, there are some institutions where there's been this huge pressure to put the staff back on, or academics back on campus to teach face-to-face, because that is what the students want, or they perceive that this is what the students want, or the university itself is in need of the tuition fee dollars, for example, or the money that can be gained through selling catering services or student accommodation services. So they have this pressure to get the students back on campus and thus the staff back on campus. And then that sort of this creates sort of a tension. And another tension that we can sort of recognize that is sort of what kind of students can be taught online, in a sense that there are students who sort of work in conditions where they don't have a very good internet access, for example, or they are sharing spaces either with, for example, relatives or several students in the same student accommodation or something like that, and thus engaging in sort of online teaching or online learning is difficult. Especially if you're forced to, for example, have your camera on. So these kinds of considerations people are sort of thinking about in our data.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Doria Abdullah is next.
Hi guys, thank you so much for the presentation. It's been really interesting because we have been talking about the same things as well in Malaysia. And for us, what we realized is that there's this trust deficit that we had by our head of departments towards the staff. So we were reminded that, okay guys, you are being paid by the taxpayers, being in a public university, so please make sure that you are working 8 hours a day. That's one response. And then another response, especially coming from the senior academics, they are having back pains and discomfort in sitting for too long, probably because pre-pandemic they were walking around. So did your respondents have that kind of responses? Thanks.
Would somebody else like to start first? I feel like I'm the one always beginning, so maybe Melina or Terhi.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe I can say something, because I had the early career group, and generally they were they didn't talk a lot about their universities or their supervisors, and the ones who did actually said very positive things, that the supervisors were really supportive of them and like, okay, this is a crisis situation, so you're not supposed to be doing what you would be otherwise doing. So I think there was a stark contrast to, for example, Terhi's group, who again had a lot more this kind of tension with the university. So maybe Terhi, you can continue from this.
I had a group with very senior people who had sort of management duties either at their departmental level or university level, and we had a lot of discussions in the group about sort of a tension between the values of the participants and the values of the universities that were perhaps very sort of driven by financial considerations and sort of serious considerations about people kind of being asked to actually not just sort of fulfill the same standards of performance as sort of before, but actually exceeding that, and situations where the departments were forced or universities were forced to cut costs by, for example, dismissing adjuncts whose work then had to be taken on by the faculty. So these kinds of considerations we sort of certainly had, and that caused not just a sort of a trust deficit, or reflected in a way the trust deficit on the side of the management level towards the academics, but also vice versa, in a sense that sort of the academics felt that their universities were not sort of actually operating according to the values that they felt were important to them.
Thank you. Something to explore, I believe, going forward.
Thanks, Doria, and thanks for the answers from Melina and Terhi. Our next speaker, next Q&A participant is Ian Mcnair. Ian.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I've been sitting here restructuring my thoughts. And I think there are several things I wanted to say. One is people present an image when they're on Zoom. I've called it wearing their environment. What does my bookcase look like? Oh, it's got 3 books with the title, the cover, displayed to their audience. And you look up closer and, oh, guess who the author was? Indeed, there was one person who's a journalist, politician, academic, who had his book enlarged and framed and on the wall. So we are doing a sort of self-promotion and a brand image polishing by this presentation. Behind me is our dining room. Basically, I've not been in the office since February of last year. And even before that, there was a progressive decision-making where I had a single occupancy office, so it was worth going into work. And I'd used to live about a mile from university. I've now moved back into the family home. I'd been seconded in various places and lived with my wife at weekends, which was good for both of us. It meant the marriage lasted 54 years rather than 4, perhaps. But progressively, I felt I was being pushed out. I moved from single occupancy, where I went to work, and there was that psychological transition of the journey where I did quite a lot of thinking. Now I do it walking down to collect the paper and walking back, and come back and scribble down what's come out of that reflection. Then to sharing with 2 of the professors, and then sharing with an assortment of 14 other academics, some of whom were very noisy. So it was impossible to work in that office. So I moved to working at home anyway. I have only a 1-day-a-week contract, and my main work is 7 doctoral students, mentoring junior colleagues and trying to write some articles. So I can do all of that at and from home. I do miss the secret meetings. I was interested in that idea of secret meetings, the corridor conversation equivalent, where you have a subset that you want to talk to, and you can do that at coffee time or whatever. And we all know that meetings are boring, but the benefit is you bump into people and can spark some things off. But my third thing is, when I first was forced to move and work from home, because we were only allowed 1 shelf for all our books and papers, and I had to transfer them all, that's why the study's overloaded, was to say, how much rent are you going to pay for the university then, requiring me to rent them an office? Silence came to reply. So there are a whole lot of things about what you identify with. I work in the dining room because there's a big table to spread out on, and I have to negotiate that with my wife. And it's actually visible as she walks past from the kitchen to the living room. And there are occasionally interruptions. We come back to that. I want to be disturbed. Sometimes I don't, and we have to get some kind of message. If the door is closed, I don't want to be disturbed. And that again has taken some change in her behavior and her tolerance. So there's a whole load of things about your identity and the place as part of your identity. As I said, the bookcases and the image thing, but the place, because you don't go anywhere else. And where do you go and reflect? and those corridor conversations. So all of those, yes, are part of my experience. It's a good preparation for retirement.
Thank you. There were a lot of really interesting things that we could talk about a lot. I loved your concept of people wearing their environment. I thought that was really great. We didn't specifically talk about this, but sometimes I would at least ask because we would always start with, where are you? What are you doing right now? And I would see that, oh, you're in a different room. Why are you there now? And they would just say that, oh, I just wanted to show this thing because I'm meeting with these people after this, and I want them to see this thing behind me. Nothing fancy, nothing prestigious, but just a thing that was common. They wanted to share with the next meeting. So definitely people are wearing their environments. I'm just showing this bulk picture because I don't want people to see my messy home. So that's another way of yep. wearing your environment. But that, I really love the concept. And a whole other thing is the question of the corridors and coffee breaks, because we're somehow used to thinking that coffee breaks are social, that's social mingling and it's important. But the coffee breaks are equally well a sort of low threshold possibility to exchange ideas, to go and ask somebody. There was a lot of discussion in my group about, okay, how do I know how to organize my teaching now? Because I can't just pop into the next office and check with X because I've always checked with X before, and things like that. So it's a lot more complex than just being in a social, like having a social break with a coffee break.
Right. And it's serendipitous.
Yeah. Yep.
Things happen you don't expect,
yep.
whereas
exactly.
with Zoom,
exactly.
it's all structured.
Exactly.
And timed and then
yeah.
excluded.
Exactly. Yeah. Terhi, you have something, yeah.
Couple of points I could make. I mentioned already the sort of issue of privacy. For example, I had in my group, I had a person who was a single caregiver with a small child, and who had moved into a fairly small accommodation and was in that accommodation working and homeschooling the child, and then who had taken to sort of preferring to organize meetings on the phone rather than Zoom, because that person did not want to share the sort of their circumstances. They didn't want their students to see that this was their desk and that was their bed. So these kinds of considerations, and then it was easier to just kind of schedule a meeting on phone rather than Zoom, because they were forced to be on Zoom all the time anyway for the teaching and so on. So those kinds of considerations. And it really does kind of emphasize that when universities come to a situation where they start making sort of decisions based on okay, now we can see that this work can be done from home. Those decisions are made by people who have big homes with a dedicated study, but it impacts people who live in sort of like single apartments, very small spaces, who then have to kind of sacrifice a large part of their space into this work permanently.
Thanks very much for that interesting discussion triggered by Ian. We've got a few more people on the list, and what I think I'll do at this stage, colleagues, with your agreement, is bring in a group of people, get comments from several people, and then ask you to respond, because I think you've all got interesting things to say. But if we do it for each person, we're going to run out of time fairly quickly. So I'm going to bring in now a group of 4, very demanding on you, I know. Beginning with Hong Bui, and we'll go to Monica, then Penny Welsh, then Christina Holgren. So I'll bring all 4 in sequence and then ask you to respond, and that'll probably take us to the end of the webinar. So Hong, would you like to come in at this point?
Simon, thank you. My comment on the chat here is that the pandemic has actually brought a positive thing to me, because I don't have time spend time on traveling, so I have more time to work. But at the same time, working from home enable more international and global collaborations for us, because academics across the globe are presumed to be working. So in that ways, and especially when you work with people from different time zones, your work tend to be like a 24 hours non-stop For example, if we start from America and then, from Asia and then back to Europe and then back to America. So, you know, it's a time like 12 hours a day, a work of constantly working. That's why we can do more than we want to do. But at the same time, we can brainstorm better, greater idea because people can synchronize at this, you know, on there in a certain time. We try to fit, you know, midday in Europe, so that people from Australia, New Zealand, and America can join. And that's why, and we've been doing so many things, and we feel that we've been, you know, doing more meaningful things for the communities. At least one conference, online conference was organized. The next one's coming in September. One book was edited and published within that year, and so many more other community projects. And that is something that I myself feel very fortunate in. That's in the new normal here. So I just wonder, in your research, did you only consider a group of people working at the same institution, or just academic in general, where they collaborate with one another, either same disciplines or across disciplines? Because here I involved with different teams, either same or different disciplines together. So yeah, just throw it back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Hong. I'm bringing Monica now. Monica Jaswal Oliver. Monica.
Thank you, Simon. Good morning, everybody. It's morning here in the US. And thank you for a wonderful presentation. Really, really enlightening. My question is, how do you think, or what do you think the future of learning is? Well, as the pandemic has taught us that distance learning or digital learning can work and does work, but not everybody, not all my students, you know, are performing at the same level as they would if they were in face-to-face classroom. So the institutions also are now focusing more on like, oh, let's bring everybody. All the classes are now supposed to be and have to be face-to-face only. But in this year and a half, all these students have found that, oh, I could cut down the time of coming on campus and I could learn, even though I'm not performing well. I could get by and still do this, you know, from distance. And then, you know, staff, they also, so it's twofold question, sorry. And the staff has also learned that they are able to reach the students digitally more. The students respond digitally and keep their meeting times when they are meeting virtually, rather than being forced to come on campus and keep their meeting. So moving along, like the question is, how do you think institutions that take this change from traditionally being on campus and making students come on campus for keeping their meetings and also learning on campus, what do you think the future should be for these institutions as learning is changing? Thank you.
Thanks, Monica. A formidable list of things to talk about there. Well done. Penny Welsh, please.
Yeah, I'm Penny Welsh from Wolverhampton, and I wondered, we touched on it, but those random conversations with colleagues and students, I know that a number of my colleagues are really missing those and wondering whether they'll ever be replicated in the future after campuses open again.
And the remaining person we're having to bring in at this point is Christina Hultgren. Are you there, Christina?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Christina Hultgren. I'm a professor of sociolinguistics at the Open University. And thank you so much, Taina and co-presenters, for this very interesting and topical presentation. My question relates partly to what Monica was asking as well earlier about the future of this research. So do you see any potential policy impact on this research, or is it too early to say? If it's not, then what might that be? Thank you.
Okay, over to you, Taina and team.
Okay, I'll just say really briefly something that I hope sort of goes over all the questions. But I'll start with Christina's question about the political impact, because that kind of crosses also on the future of learning and work in general. And I'm okay with social impact. It's always hard to say. Like, it's a long-term development, and you usually see things afterwards as it is. But I'm thinking that there's definitely something happening in higher education, that this might be seen as an occasion to move more onto distance work, to distance teaching, to make changes that have maybe been planned but haven't been done yet. But of course, it's hard to say. And when I think of Monica's question of learners particularly, or even staff as well, I mean, the same applies to that. We don't really know. We've sort of tended to assume that everybody is comfortable with the on-site physical face-to-face teaching and work. But I mean, people are different, situations are different, institutions are different. And it seems it might be that the digital move might cause a change that's beneficial to other people that have benefited from the on-site face-to-face kind of work and teaching. So I'm also guessing that this might, in that sense, change our understanding of what is pedagogy and what we understand as important in terms of pedagogy. But I'll leave some time to Melina and Terhi as well.
Okay, who would like to go next?
Yeah, maybe I could just briefly address the positive aspects, which came up in, I think, the first question is, since I'm also one of the participants, so we have the also ethnographic aspect to it. So for me as well, I could recognize that this pandemic has also brought a lot of positive things to me. I used to do I did my entire PhD basically online. And I used to be the person who was the only person online, and I was always trying to make people meet on Zoom, and this was not many people were very open to this, and it was really difficult to make happen. And then suddenly everyone was there, so my life suddenly became much easier in many sense, which is terrible to admit, because I could see how it's really challenging for many. And yet I do acknowledge that, and I was able to accept a job that I think I could not have otherwise been able to accept, because I could do online teaching, and I could not have gone to that country otherwise. So positive things, but then again, I do realize that I'm very privileged in that sense. I only have a partner to worry about. I don't have children and all this. So here we see the different circumstances between different academics, whether early career or not. Although then again, starting to teach basically for the first time during a pandemic, that is quite a challenging thing to do. And I can admit that I'm already fearing September. What if I need to teach hybrid? How do I make that happen? And I almost hope I don't have to do that. So it's either online or either physically face-to-face. And I hate having these kinds of feelings, because I've also always been the one who wants to be wants to have the opportunity to be online. So maybe that kinds of things I would like to add.
Terhi, do you want to say anything?
I think that most questions were already kind of one way or another addressed. I think one interesting issue to consider is that we have thought, I think, in a way that online means accessible. And in some cases it means accessible. And some of the comments in the chat, I can see that also indicates that this has created access for many people for many things. But then when we look at it from a global perspective, it doesn't always mean access, because, you know, globally there are lots of people for whom internet access is still sort of a problem. Or people may be temporarily in situations where internet access is a problem. And we can see this in our data as well, that, you know, some, for example, support personnel may live in circumstances where they don't have internet access, and then they sort of, there is no funding to make that internet access happen from their home, and these kinds of situations. So and at the same time, I think that locally it can mean situations where even those say, for example, if we're talking about leaders, departmental leaders or managers who may have an open door policy once they are kind of in the office, and they can say, okay, you can always come and talk to me, but does that really still hold true when they disappear into Zoom meetings and team meetings and all sorts of crisis meetings when the pandemic suddenly hits, and then sort of, so there's a lot of kind of access changes in a way that I think would be very, very interesting to dig into.
Can I just say really quickly on Penny's question about the random talks? I think that's, the randomness has been undervalued in our work previously, and I think that's something that we might start missing. We start missing the or what Jan calls serendipity. Like we maybe, rather than think of like I said, rather than think of the breaks as something social, something chit-chatty with their colleagues and having a cup of coffee, they are often, the random encounters are often something that produce things that we don't anticipate. And I think that's for me, that's a big, personally for me, that's a big, that's what I miss, the randomness.
Yeah, I think the pandemic is enabling us all to think about things in a different way. I mean, this is really interesting, and isn't it interesting how time and space is something we kind of revisit when there are these very big material shifts all in common. I mean, wars, revolutions also bring to us a different sense of time and space. I mean, people find themselves moving around in wartime in ways they didn't expect, not moving, but moving often, and not always willingly. And of course, time feels different. And, you know, in revolutionary situations where there are big shifts socially, politically going on, things that get this compressed in this different way. And so we sense it differently. But I suppose what your work is doing is drawing attention to the way in which it's very much about how we imagine things and perceive them that's at work here, and as well as the materiality of the shifts that are occurring. And, you know, it was Kant, I think said that time and space were the coordinates through which we make our world. At the same time, he tried to objectify those coordinates as much as possible by having this personal regime where he did everything according to the clock. He would cross the town square to go and have his morning tea at exactly the same time every day, and stuck to this rhythm and this routine, and did his scholarly work in the same kind of structured way. So he imposed upon himself a kind of objectification of time and space. And in a nutshell, I think, of course, we're all less organized than Kant, but I think, you know, he basically, you know, what he did is what we do instinctively. And most of the time we think about ourselves as just adjusting to the times that we're in, just going with the flow or whatever. But in fact, what we're doing is making it, you know, we're actually structuring time. And we use the concept of time management, which is us doing what Kant did, which is sorting out our time for ourselves, using time management as a resource to create more activity or more production or less, or to withdraw, to get a break and so on. And it's the same with space. I mean, we find ourselves normally living in space. We experience space in that way as a kind of fixed thing, but now we're managing space, and we were doing what Ian was talking about. We're managing the way we relate to it and use it, but also we're forming spaces virtually more actively, I think, than we were before. So there's a lot of creation of space going on through this very easy way we have of creating a conversation between people in different places. But in all of this, I think there's us as individuals and time and space that we're both responding to and managing and creating and perceiving. But there's also social relations. So our activities are actually conditioned by relations with each other very much. So we're not just operating autonomously or separately in that sense, autarkically, but we're doing things in relation to what others are doing and what we perceive as the evolving relational network and its expectations and mores and protocols and so on. So, and that's changing. And so, you know, Terry's early point, you know, that the employer-employee relationship might be changing. I think that's the big unanswered question is whether there's a permanent change going on there. I suspect that the teaching and learning relationship may not change as much as we think, but possibly the institutional to employee relationship is, and perhaps the institution to student relation are going through bigger changes. But what I notice, especially in my work, is that our global connections are changing, and I think this will be permanent. I mean, I think we will have ongoing global webinars much more often than we did. So we've got in this strange world we're now moving into, with a more localized and parochial politics combined with a more relational global sociality. You know, two different sets of relations, one about politics and the other one about everything else, but seem to be working now in different ways. And I think that is not stable. You know, that's not going to stay like that. Yeah. Anyway, look, thanks very much for this fantastic webinar, which really opened up our existing reality for us, helped us talk and think about ourselves so well. So, you know, let me say, come back again, as we often say on our webinar program. You know, you're very welcome to take part in further discussions with our colleagues, the many colleagues from many places that we've had on today, and of course others. Our next webinar, folks, is the first of two we're running in conjunction with Boston College of Education, particularly through Rebecca Schendel, and the American Council on Education. So, we've achieved this, you know, rare goal of tapping into the American market, which people coming from Europe so often aspire to and so rarely achieve. So we're having this rare glimpse of the American market, inverted commas, or the American conversation, to put it more correctly. And we're having two webinars with ACE and Boston College, and they're both about women in leadership in higher education. The first one is going to have a cast of nine presenters in the hour, coming from a range of countries, discussing aspects of women in leadership in the sector. And the second webinar has a more, I suppose, modest speaking list of three. So that's Tuesday and Thursday next week. We already have about 200 people signed up for each of those, so we expect quite a large participation. So I do hope that the many good colleagues have been engaged in this discussion today will also join us for Women in Leadership next week. Once again, thank you, Melina, Terhi, and Taina, and bye for now, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.